In a previous episode of Garage Noise, we straightened and repaired this forward bedside. And then we applied 2 coats of 2K urethane primer. Today, I'll walk you through the process of blocking this repair straight and how to properly prepare this bedside for paint. The purpose for applying 2 coats of 2K urethane primer, that gives us enough material that we can take a block and a piece of sandpaper and sand down that primer, blocking over it in an X pattern. What that does is that's going to straighten out any waves that we might have in our body filler that could show up in our final repair. So I went ahead and covered the repair area with a guide coat. This is a black powder that's going to show us any high or low areas as we're blocking out this primer. It's a good idea to use the longest block possible over the repair area. This is going to help level out this panel and get it straight. So I've chosen a large block here, and I'm using some 220 grit sandpaper to start with. I'm not going to finish with this 220, but just to start blocking it straight, we're going to use 220. 220 is going to sand this primer a little bit faster. You could use 320 or something even less aggressive, but it may take a little bit longer. So we'll step our way down. We'll use 220 first, and then we'll step it to 320, and finally we'll get to 600 grit. Now I've lightly blocked this bedside, and you can start to see where all these low areas are. Now I'm not finished blocking it, but I wanted to give you an example of how this guide coat works. So as I block in an X pattern or a crosshatch pattern, these low areas are going to be exposed. So anywhere where that black guide coat is a little low area or a wave, and that needs to be continued blocking until that disappears. Now you could go through into metal, or you could go through into body filler. If that happens, you need to stop and kind of determine what's going on there. Do you have a high area, or do you have an area that's so low that you need to apply more primer or more filler? So as I'm blocking, I want to hold my block flat against that panel. If I can't hold it flat against the panel, then I don't want to block that area. So some of the wheel arches and the contours in this body, we're going to have to use a smaller block or a flexible block that's shaped to go around those contours. If you're not able to hold your block flat against the panel, then you're defeating the purpose of blocking, and you actually could be creating waves in your repair. So it's very important to be able to hold your block flat and get that straightened out. You also want to block in long strokes whenever possible. So you can see the guide coat is starting to disappear. You can also see that I've broken through the primer into body filler. So we need to address that. I'll feel over it and we'll determine what's going on there and what's causing that. So we've blocked through the primer into body filler, and what I've determined is that's just a high area in the body filler. So sometimes that can be blocked down to the primer and straightened out. Now don't be afraid to put another coat of primer on your repair. This is a small flexible block that I'm going to use to block around the corners of this bedside. That'll help get it straight, and it will bend to the contours of that panel. Just because you expose body filler when you're blocking does not mean that's a high area. It could be a low around that body filler. So you need to use your hand, feel over, and determine, do you have a low area in front of that body filler, or is that high? Now I'm going to use a shorter flexible block with 220 grit sandpaper and block the lower section of this bedside. And the reason I'm using a flexible block is because this has a slight contour into that wheel opening, and I want to be able to hold my block flat against the panel in order to get it straight. We are blocking in an X pattern or a crosshatch pattern to get the best results possible. If you're finding this video helpful, then give me a like and let me know down in the comments below. Let's finish up blocking out this panel, and then I'll show you how we mix up some primer and apply it to this bedside. Now we have this bedside all blocked out and ready for a final coat of primer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray it down with some wax and grease remover. This is a good way to check your body work. You spray it on, and then you can look at it in the light It mimics clear coat, and you can see if there's any waves or anything you might have missed. It looks good to me, so we're going to go ahead and mix up some 2K urethane primer. The primer we're using today is the Roberlo ME1. I'll put a little liner in my cup, and to read these cups, you can see there's numbers at the top. Now this mixes up 4-to-1. So we find the 4-to-1, we mix up 4 parts of the primer, and then 1 part of the activator. I'm going to thin this primer down a little bit with a little bit of reducer, about 15%. This allows to give us a nice smooth primer, easier to sand, and then we can do a final sanding on this and be ready for paint. So I'm applying this primer with the 3M Performance gun. I'm using a 1.4 tip, and we're just going to put 2 good coats on it. I have thinned out this primer with a little bit of reducer so it's not quite as thick. And this is going to allow it to sand easier and to be applied smoother. I'm using a pretty low air pressure, only about 15 psi. I don't need overspray going everywhere, and it doesn't require that much air pressure to lay this primer on smooth. To give this primer a little kickstart and help it cure, we're going to put our infrared light on it, let it set up for about 2 hours. I think I let it sit overnight. We'll put a little bit of guide coat on it and teach Darius how to block this thing out. We'll give him the long block with some 320 grit sandpaper and let him get to blocking. So I've got him blocking in a crosshatch or X pattern, but he was putting too much pressure on the board trying to block it. You don't need a ton of pressure. Just let the sandpaper do the work. Medium pressure is perfect for blocking out primer. The guide coat will also tell you when all the texture is removed from that primer, because you want that primer super smooth before you start applying any paint. Darius is finishing up the blocking on this, and then we're going to switch over to an orbital sander with some 600 grit sandpaper on an interface pad. And an interface pad is a soft pad that'll move with the contours of the panel. And we want to use 600 grit sandpaper because it's a fine enough sandpaper. It's going to allow that paint to adhere properly, but it's also not going to show any scratches through our paint or clear coat. So we're machine sanding all the texture out of this primer. You want it to be super smooth. Now you could do this by hand. You could wet sand it with some 600 grit sandpaper, and that'll make it really smooth as well. This is a silver paint, so we want to make sure all those deep scratches have been removed, or they could show up in our paint and our clear coat. I also have some other tips and tricks when painting silver, but we'll talk about all that in the next video when we paint this truck. But we're not done prepping out this truck for paint. Let me show you what we're going to do for the blending area. So before we sand the blend area, we're going to clean it. We want to use wax and grease remover and clean it really well. We don't want to sand any of those oils or any contaminants into the paint. And then we'll sand over that front part of that bedside with 600 grit sandpaper. Then we'll wash it all down with wax and grease remover. Before we tape this up for paint, we want to sand all the edges with a gray Scotch-Brite or a 600 grit foam pad. We want to knock the shine off those areas so the clear coat will adhere properly. Now this vehicle is a two-tone color. It's a blue on the bottom and then a silver on the top. Silver can be tricky to paint, and in the next episode I'm going to show you all the tricks I use to get a flawless silver finish. We're going to talk about a wet bed, we're going to talk about a sealer, and how to blend silver and high metallic paints. So be ready for it. Turn your notifications on. I appreciate each and every one of you watching, and we'll see you next time on Garage Noise.